Prices have risen for lots of foods, but the cost of eggs climbed the most in the last year, and consumers and businesses have scrambled to keep up. What's behind so-called eggflation?
Economy and to a troubling new forecast when it comes to the price of eggs, now predicted to rise more than 40% this year, double the prediction just a month ago. And tonight, what more restaurants now say they're being forced to do.
Prices have soared to new records over the last couple of months. The wholesale price for a dozen white eggs climbed to over $8 in February. Since then, that price has come down, but prices consumers pay at the grocery store are still high. Our economics correspondent, Paul Solman, takes a look at what's been going on.
Eggs, one of the simplest foods on the American table, are now at the center of a global political standoff no one expected. Across Africa, multiple governments are rejecting U.S. egg imports, shutting their doors to American suppliers who once dominated poultry trade. The decision isn't just about food safety or local farming. Anymore, it's about economic independence, trade leverage, and power. For years, U.S. producers treated Africa as a guaranteed export market. Cheap surplus eggs flowed overseas, locking African farmers out of their own shelves. But now African leaders are pushing back, choosing to protect local poultry industries and keep their food economies at home. And Washington is furious, because this rejection doesn't just hit African markets, it hits U.S. supply chains. Losing export destinations leaves American farms with massive surpluses, collapsing contracts, and billions at risk. When export systems break, domestic prices shift, and suddenly, grocery stores feel the pressure. A decision made thousands of miles away is now sitting on American breakfast plates. The real question isn't whether Africa can block U.S. eggs, they already are. The question is, will this move backfire on American consumers? Or mark the beginning of a food trade power shift away from the United States? For decades, America rarely questioned where its food power came from. The U.S. wasn't just feeding itself, it was feeding the world. Mountains of grain, rivers of oil, oceans of meat and poultry left American ports daily, binding dozens of countries into a food supply system centered around U.S. producers. And for a long time, Africa stood right near the heart of that web, not as an equal partner, but as a destination for America's agricultural overflow. Eggs were part of that story. When U.S. mega farms produced more eggs than the domestic market could absorb, Africa became a pressure valve. Surplus shipments moved across the Atlantic, sold at rock-bottom prices that undercut local poultry farmers who couldn't compete with U.S. industrial scale. These imports were framed as food assistance, trade cooperation, or capacity support. But on the ground, African farmers watched imported eggs dominate store shelves while their own flocks struggled to survive. Over time, the resentment built. Local poultry associations complained. Rural cooperatives protested. Agricultural ministers warned that Africa would never achieve food independence while remaining dependent on imported basics like eggs. The argument was simple. If you can't protect something as fundamental as your poultry sector, how can you ever build real food security? The shift began quietly. African governments began introducing stricter quality-based import regulations, updated packaging standards, freshness requirements, and disease prevention controls. Rules applied broadly but felt most sharply by U.S. exporters. Certification delays stretched from weeks to months. Import permits that once sailed through now sat frozen on bureaucratic desks. Trade shipments stalled. Then the public announcements came. Country after country promoted a new policy goal: local first food sourcing. Government contracts prioritized domestic poultry producers. Public institutions, schools, hospitals, the military were instructed to buy locally supplied eggs only. Import quotas tightened. Inspection rejections rose, and in some cases, a total rejection of U.S. egg imports followed. The reasoning varied from nation to nation: farm protection, disease concerns, economic sovereignty. But the message was unified. Africa would stop serving as a dumping ground for American surplus. The response inside Washington was immediate and furious. From the U.S. perspective, Africa wasn't supposed to behave this way. The continent had long been viewed as a developing market tied to American commodity flows. Export contracts were priced assuming reliable access to African buyers. Shipping firms depended on steady volume. Poultry conglomerates expanded infrastructure believing surplus could always be offloaded overseas. Africa changing direction wasn't just unexpected, it was financially dangerous. Because when export pipelines collapse, the ripple travels backward. Egg production in the U.S. doesn't slow. Quickly, hens lay whether markets exist or not. Feed contracts stay locked in. Debt payments continue. Warehouse cold storage fills up. For a brief time, surplus stock drives domestic prices downward, crushing smaller American poultry farmers who rely on stable egg pricing to survive. Some go bankrupt, others sell out to megacorporations, increasing industry concentration even further. But the surplus phase never lasts long. Processors eventually destroy excess supply to stabilize prices. Farms reduce flocks months later to prevent new overproduction. When supply tightens again, especially before high-demand seasons like school reopenings or the holidays, prices rebound fast. This is the part most consumers never notice coming. What begins as a foreign trade rejection becomes a domestic market shock months later. Fewer flocks, reduced output, distribution bottlenecks, higher logistics costs. Grocery shelves don't go empty immediately, but prices creep upward, usually without warning, and suddenly checkout lines buzz with confusion. How did eggs get expensive? Again, the official explanations point to feed costs, disease outbreaks, or transportation inflation. Rarely does anyone mention the underlying geopolitical shift that parts of the export network once buffering U.S. supply were cut off entirely. Africa rejecting U.S. eggs isn't just symbolism. It directly affects how the U.S. manages its agricultural output flow. Meanwhile, on the African side of the ocean, something different is happening altogether. Local poultry farmers are expanding production. Cooperative farms win new government procurement contracts. Hatcheries open in regions long dependent on imports. Feed mills grow. Jobs appear. Rural economies stabilize. For the first time in decades, some countries approach near self-sufficiency in basic egg supply. African leaders begin framing the policy shift as more than food protection; they call it economic liberation. Eating what we produce is the first step towards sovereignty. One agriculture minister declares at a trade summit that language unsettles Washington far more than the lost egg contracts ever could, because sovereignty in food becomes leverage in diplomacy. A nation that controls its staples isn't easily coerced by aid conditions, trade threats, or political pressure. Food dependency has always been a tool of foreign influence, and Africa cutting off U.S. eggs weakens that instrument. Suddenly, what seemed like a small poultry trade policy looks like part of a far bigger realignment. African nations aren't acting alone. Across the continent, new agricultural partnerships are forming with Middle Eastern food investors, Asian logistics firms, and regional development banks injecting capital into poultry modernization. Cold chains improve, regional trade corridors expand. Cross-border egg distribution within Africa becomes economically viable, replacing foreign imports. The continent's food networks are slowly turning inward and outward toward new allies rather than back toward the U.S. American poultry executives see the danger clearly. Africa was never the most profitable export destination, but it was among the most reliable for volume. Losing that stability forces companies into riskier overseas markets where competition is brutal and regulations tighter. It also leaves more eggs competing domestically, destabilizing pricing across the board, and the politics in Washington become louder. Agriculture lobby groups accuse African governments of unfair trade barriers. Congressional delegations threaten aid funding reviews. Diplomatic cables protest that food imports should remain open trade channels rather than economic nationalism. But in Africa, the reaction to such pressure produces the opposite effect. Public opinion rallies behind food independence. Politicians who once supported unrestricted imports back off, fearing voter backlash for being seen as submissive to foreign agricultural interests. The egg becomes symbolic, no longer just a food item, but proof that Africa can choose itself over foreign pressure. Meanwhile, U.S. consumers remain largely unaware that geopolitical shifts are rippling through their grocery aisles. They notice only symptoms: price hikes, purchase limits, shrinking egg cartons quietly relabeled with new standard sizing. Social media erupts with inflation complaints. Cable news debates corporate greed or farm inefficiencies. Rarely does anyone trace the chain reaction back across the Atlantic, where a series of trade rejections quietly reshaped a supply network built over decades. And as this story deepens, something more troubling for Washington begins to happen. The egg rejection emboldens African policymakers across other commodities. Wheat import substitution plans expand. Cooking oil protection schemes grow. Local sugar production incentives increase. Cotton textile processing incentives follow. The narrative momentum spreads. If we can defend eggs, what else can we reclaim? And for the first time in modern global trade, a coordinated food sovereignty movement emerges across much of Africa, not driven by ideology alone, but by proven market success. The egg was simply the pilot test. Now U.S. agriculture finds itself facing a new uncomfortable reality. The world's fastest-growing market region is actively choosing not to rely on American food production, and it has the political support to sustain that choice. At home, American farm industry analysts begin warning of structural instability. Without reliable export safety valves, the U.S. poultry sector's boom-bust cycles intensify, pushing small farms out and driving consolidation into a few mega producers more vulnerable to political trade shifts. Consumer volatility grows, and through it all, the average shopper remains disconnected from the geopolitical chessboard shaping their grocery bill. They simply stare at the new numbers stuck to egg cartons and wonder why basic food keeps getting harder to afford. The truth sits half a world away, in a continent redefining what economic independence means. Africa is not just rejecting American eggs. Africa is rejecting dependence, and the consequences of that decision are only just beginning to be felt. What makes this story so powerful isn't trade policy or diplomatic tension, it's the simple truth that power shows itself in ordinary things. Not in missiles or speeches or grand alliances, but in eggs sitting on a grocery shelf. A mother standing in the aisle calculating whether to buy one carton or two feels the weight of a global system she never asked to be part of. A diner owner wondering how long he can keep breakfast prices low is actually struggling against forces stretching across oceans. A student choosing between protein or cheaper noodles is unknowingly reacting to a decision made thousands of miles away by leaders protecting farmers they may never meet. This is what geopolitics looks like when it leaves conference rooms and lands in daily life. Africa's decision to reject U.S. egg imports is not a strike against Americans, it is a declaration for African farmers who fought decades for the right to compete on their own soil. It is the voice of local producers saying they don't want charity shipments dressed as trade partnerships. They want fair markets, real protection, and a chance to feed their own people first. But for Americans, the emotional reality feels different. When prices jump, the instinct is to look inward to blame grocery chains, trucking costs, or farm inefficiency. Few realize that the world has changed faster than our assumptions, that the era when the U.S. controlled most of the global food web may be slipping quietly away. And that change can be unsettling, because power used to feel predictable, exports flowed. Markets stayed open, demand remained steady, stability benefited consumers. Now stability is fading. Africa's stand is part of a much broader movement, nations tired of having their basic survival tethered to foreign supply. Countries investing in self-reliance not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Food security is the first true form of sovereignty, and sovereignty is something every nation eventually fights for. The painful irony is that while Africa moves toward independence, ordinary Americans feel more dependent than ever, struggling with rising costs, shrinking wages, and endless uncertainty at the checkout counter. 2. Continents moving in opposite emotional directions, one gaining economic confidence, one losing affordability, and both are simply trying to protect their people. There is no villain here, just a world in transition. But transitions are never gentle. They are felt in households before they are explained on news screens. Every small trade shifts tax on top of others: cocoa today, eggs tomorrow, wheat the next season, until consumers no longer recognize what affordability even feels like. What began as Africa's defense of local poultry farming has become a mirror reflecting a larger truth. No nation controls global markets forever. The doors that once stayed open automatically now require negotiation, respect, and genuine partnership. Old influence tactics don't work the way they used to. The world is multipolar now, and food power is becoming decentralized. For Americans, the challenge ahead is not about blaming Africa or any other nation trying to stabilize its economy. It is about understanding that domestic prices are no longer set entirely at home. The grocery bill is shaped by geopolitics just as much as supply chains and interest rates. And for Africans, this moment is about proving that protection policies translate into real prosperity, not corruption, inefficiency, or isolation, but growing farms, rising wages, and food security for millions. The next few years will tell us whether this shift becomes a model of independence that empowers communities or another chapter in economic rivalry that leaves consumers on all sides paying the cost. But one truth remains clear: an egg is no longer just an egg. It is a symbol of changing power, of who feeds whom in a world no longer dominated by a single economic center. And the next time someone stands in the grocery aisle staring at higher prices, they may not think of distant farms, ministerial meetings, or export bans, but behind that quiet moment of frustration lies a powerful story. Africa choosing to feed itself first, and America discovering what it means to live in a world where food power is shared.